"Please do touch me," she whispered. When the rancher lifted the blanket, his blood turned to Ike. John sat on the old wooden porch of his ranch, staring at the horizon where the last orange light of the sunset faded into dark gray clouds. It had been a long day, tending to the cattle and fixing fences damaged by the early winter storm. Normally, he would have gone inside by now, poured himself a cup of hot coffee, and settled near the fire. But something about this evening felt different. The air seemed heavier, almost alive, carrying a sense of tension he couldn't explain. John had lived on this ranch for almost 20 years. After losing his parents in a car accident when he was a young man, he had inherited this land, and over time, it had become his entire world. He liked the peace that came with solitude, the steady rhythm of life tied to the animals, the soil, and the changing seasons. He was used to the isolation, it suited him, but tonight, even in the familiar surroundings, something felt off. Perhaps it was the storm roaring across the valley with a force he had never felt before. Or perhaps it was the small, fleeting feeling that someone was watching him from the edge of the tree line. He brushed the thought away and went back inside. The ranch house was old but sturdy, filled with the faint smell of wood smoke and worn leather. John placed his tools down on the counter and went to the stove to warm up some soup he had made earlier. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and he found himself listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint whistle of wind through the cracks in the windows. This was his routine, and he liked it, simple, predictable, safe. Suddenly, a knock came at the door. It was soft, hesitant, almost like the sound had been carried by the wind itself. John froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Visitors were rare here, especially at this hour. The storm had turned the roads into muddy tracks, and anyone brave enough to travel now would be desperate. He considered ignoring it, but something in the back of his mind told him he couldn't. He moved cautiously to the door and opened it a crack. Standing on the porch was a woman. Her clothes were soaked from the snow and rain, her hair plastered to her face. She looked exhausted, frightened, and small against the vastness of the dark landscape behind her. Her eyes, wide and wary, met his, and John felt a strange twinge of concern. She wasn't smiling, wasn't speaking. She only lifted her hand slightly, a silent plea for help. John didn't know her, but something about her presence pulled at his sense of duty. He opened the door fully. "Come inside," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll catch your death out there in this storm." She nodded slightly, not speaking, and shuffled into the house like a frightened animal. He closed the door behind her, and the warmth of the fire hit her first. She shivered violently, rubbing her arms against herself, and John immediately went to fetch a thick wool blanket from the closet. "Here," he said, draping it over her shoulders. She murmured something under her breath, almost too soft to hear, and pressed the blanket closer to her body. John noticed her hands. They were red and raw from the cold, fingers trembling even under the thick fabric. She was clearly in shock, her body tense, her breathing uneven. He gestured toward the small living area near the fireplace. "Sit here," he said gently. "You'll be safe for now. I'll make some tea." She sat, hunched over, eyes darting to every shadow and corner as if expecting someone or something to appear. John busied himself in the kitchen, boiling water and setting out cups. He didn't want to rush her, didn't want to force her to speak, but he couldn't ignore the tension that hung in the air like smoke. The storm outside rattled the windows and shook the roof, and every gust of wind seemed to make her flinch. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't touch me." John froze, one hand holding the kettle. The words were soft, fearful, almost desperate. He stepped back, careful not to crowd her, and nodded. "I won't. You're safe here. No one will touch you." Her eyes met his for a brief moment, wide and searching before dropping back to her lap. There was something in her gaze, fear, yes, but also relief. She seemed to weigh his words, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Slowly, she curled herself more tightly in the blanket, her small frame shaking slightly. John gave her space, keeping a respectful distance, and sat in the armchair across the room, pretending to sip his tea while keeping a careful watch. Minutes passed, then hours. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Snow piled against the windows, muffling the sounds of the world outside. John kept the fire going, topping up the kettle and making quiet, neutral conversation. He didn't push her to speak, just offered small reassurances. "You don't have to tell me anything until you're ready," he said at one point. She gave a faint nod, her fingers tightening around the blanket. As the night deepened, John learned small things about her without her saying much. She moved carefully, like every step had been calculated, and she avoided the kitchen and the fire, keeping to the corner of the room. There were moments when she would glance out the window, as if scanning the darkness beyond, then flinch back into herself. John felt a mixture of worry and frustration. He wanted to help her, but she was clearly carrying a weight he couldn't yet understand. The wind outside screamed louder, rattling the door and shaking the old window panes. John felt a chill, but it was nothing compared to the tension in the room. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. She was here for a reason, that much was clear, but she wasn't ready to tell him what that reason was. And John, despite his quiet, solitary life, felt a strange sense of responsibility. He had lived alone for so long, building walls around himself, but this woman, so small, so afraid, had somehow found a way past them. Hours slipped by, and gradually she seemed to relax slightly. The trembling slowed, and her eyes lost some of their frantic edge. She finally looked at John, her gaze lingering on his face for just a moment before darting away again. He smiled faintly, a simple, reassuring gesture, and returned to tending the fire. In that small, simple room, with the storm raging outside, two strangers found themselves sharing a fragile, unspoken connection. Neither spoke much, yet each understood the silent language of fear and trust. John had no idea who she was, what had brought her to his door, or what dangers lay behind her quiet plea. But he knew one thing for certain: she needed help, and he would not turn her away. The night stretched on, long and dark, filled with the distant howl of wind and the occasional creak of the old house settling. John kept his eyes on her from time to time, noticing the subtle signs, the way she flinched at a shadow, the way she clutched the blanket closer. He wondered what horrors she had escaped, what story lay hidden behind those whispered words. But he knew that for now, the only thing he could do was keep her safe, keep her warm, and wait until she was ready to speak. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, casting pale light across the snow-covered fields, she had fallen into a fitful sleep in the chair, still wrapped tightly in the blanket. John sat nearby, sipping his tea, staring out at the world beyond his ranch. For the first time in years, the quiet of his life felt different, less predictable, more urgent. He knew that the arrival of this frightened woman would change everything, though he did not yet know how. The storm outside had begun to ease, but a different kind of storm. The one that began within the walls of his home was only just starting. Morning came slowly to the ranch, with pale light creeping through the frost-covered windows. John stirred from his chair, careful not to wake Claire, who was still curled under the thick blanket in the corner. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside silent except for the occasional creak of the old house and the soft hiss of melting snow. The ranch, which had felt so alive with the howling winds of the previous night, now seemed calm, almost serene. But inside, the tension lingered, like a shadow that refused to disappear. John moved quietly to the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. He boiled water for tea and set out some bread and jam. He kept glancing toward Claire, noticing how she shifted in her sleep, her brows furrowed as if she were still chasing some terrible thought in her dreams. Despite the safety of his home, she had not completely relaxed. The events of last night, The storm, the arrival of a stranger, her obvious fear, had left their mark. He poured a cup of tea and carried it over to her, setting it gently on the small table beside her chair. She stirred slightly, her eyes half open, and glanced at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she reached for the cup, wrapping her cold hands around it as if the warmth could chase away more than just the chill. John took a seat across from her, keeping his distance, sensing that patience was the only way to earn her trust. After a long pause, she whispered, I can't stay long." Her voice was quiet, trembling. John nodded, offering no question, no judgment. He had learned that pressing someone who was frightened often pushed them further away. Instead, he simply said, "You can stay as long as you need. No one is going to make you leave." She looked down, her fingers tightening around the cup, and then took a small sip of the tea. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the muted sounds of the wind brushing the roof. John studied her carefully. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed too alert, too aware for someone so exhausted. Her clothes were still damp, but she had refused to remove her coat entirely, keeping it wrapped around her like armor. He noticed small details, the way her hands shook slightly even as she held the cup, the faint bruise forming under her eye, the thin line of worry etched between her eyebrows. Each detail told a story she was not ready to speak aloud. John did not ask directly. Instead, he tried to create normality. "The storm left a lot of snow," he said softly. "It's going to take hours to clear the paths to the barn. I was thinking I'd start with the fences once the sun is up." She nodded slightly, barely looking at him, and whispered, "Fences," almost as if repeating the word to anchor herself. He understood that she was grasping at something ordinary, something safe. He went about his morning chores, carrying buckets of water and stacking firewood while keeping an eye on her. Occasionally, she would shift in her chair, glance toward the door, then look back at the fire. John sensed a mixture of fear and determination in her movements, fear of the unknown, determination to survive whatever had brought her here. As the day wore on, John began to notice more subtle behaviors. She avoided the kitchen entirely after breakfast, choosing to sit closer to the corner of the room, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Whenever he approached, she flinched, whispering the same words from last night, "Please, don't touch me." He respected her space, though the curiosity gnawed at him. He wanted to understand what had happened to her, what had driven her to arrive at his door in such a state. But he knew he had to wait for her to share, if ever she chose to. By late morning, the sunlight had begun to soften the icy landscape outside. Snow glistened in the light, and the air felt slightly warmer. John decided to try and ease her mind with small acts of kindness, things that didn't require words. He brought over a clean towel, placed a bowl of warm soup near her, and even set out a soft pillow on the chair. She accepted these gestures quietly, casting him a brief, uncertain glance, then focusing on the food or the warmth. Each small interaction was a step toward trust, even if she didn't realize it herself. Despite the calm appearance, John could feel the tension under the surface. Every time she heard a noise from the barn or the forest beyond, she stiffened. She jumped slightly when a bird landed on the windowsill. Every shadow seemed to carry the weight of her fear. John realized that she was not just tired or cold. She was on edge from something far deeper, something that had chased her here. He wanted to help, but he knew that forcing her to speak would only make things worse. The hours passed slowly. John worked quietly around the house, repairing a loose floorboard, sweeping the kitchen and feeding the animals outside, all while keeping one eye on Claire. Occasionally, she would shift in her seat, looking out the window or glancing at him. Each glance was fleeting, filled with both curiosity and caution. John sensed that she wanted to trust him but wasn't ready yet. As the afternoon approached, she finally spoke more, her voice still soft but firmer than before. I don't want anyone to find me." John nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words without asking for details. "Then you won't," he said. "You're safe here. I won't let anyone come near you." She relaxed slightly, sinking further into the blanket, though her eyes still darted to the door and windows as if expecting someone to appear. John realized that she needed more than warmth or food. She needed the comfort of routine, the assurance that someone was watching out for her. He began to involve her in small tasks that were safe and predictable. She helped stir the soup, carry kindling to the fireplace, and water the small indoor plants. Each task was simple, yet it gave her a sense of control in a world that had clearly been chaotic for her. As the light outside began to fade, John prepared for the evening. He lit the fire in the main room, filling the house with warmth and light. The shadows of the room shifted with the flickering flames, and for a brief moment the house felt like a refuge, a small island of safety in a vast, uncertain world. Claire moved closer to the fire, still wrapped in her blanket, and John sat across from her, giving her space but remaining attentive. That night, they ate a simple dinner together in silence. She picked at her food, not speaking much, but John noticed that her posture had relaxed slightly. She no longer flinched at every sound, and her eyes, though wary, showed a faint flicker of trust. He realized that trust, in her case, would take time, patience, and respect for her boundaries. As the evening grew darker, the quiet between them became less tense. John spoke softly about the ranch, the animals, and the routines that filled his days. He avoided prying into her past, focusing instead on the ordinary details of his life. To his surprise, she listened, asking the occasional question about the animals or the land. It was a small connection, but it mattered. Before bed, John made sure Claire was comfortable, arranging her blanket and pillow carefully in the corner chair. She had begun to relax, her breathing steadying as sleep finally overtook her. John sat for a while by the fire, reflecting on the day. He realized that the arrival of this frightened young woman had brought a new rhythm to his quiet life. Her fear was evident, but so was her resilience. He didn't know the full story yet, and he didn't need to. For now, keeping her safe, giving her space, and offering kindness was enough. Outside, the last light of day faded, and the stars appeared in the clear winter sky. The wind had died down, leaving a calm hush over the snow-covered ranch. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the small room. John sat silently, listening to Claire's slow, steady breathing, feeling a mixture of concern, curiosity, and determination. He knew that the days ahead would be challenging, that her story might reveal dangers he could barely imagine. But he also knew one thing clearly: he would not turn her away. Not now, not ever. And as the night stretched on, with the quiet of the house and the faint sound of snow shifting outside, John realized that life at the ranch had changed forever. A stranger had arrived in the storm, carrying fear, mystery, and unspoken stories, and he had chosen to open his door, to offer safety and warmth. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, John felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, the ranch felt different. The storm had left a blanket of snow over everything, turning the fields into a quiet, white expanse that stretched to the horizon. John stepped outside early, boots crunching against the frozen ground, to check on the animals. The cows huddled together near the barn, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The horses stamped their hooves impatiently, eager to be fed and let out into the cleared paths. John moved with his usual calm efficiency, bringing hay, breaking the ice in the water troughs, and ensuring that everything was in order. But even in the routine of his work, he could not stop thinking about Claire. She had woken up before him, he realized, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was sitting near the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with a faraway expression. John noticed how tense she still seemed, despite the safety of the ranch and the warmth of the fire. Her eyes, dark and alert, scanned every shadow outside as if expecting someone or something to appear at any moment. He decided to approach carefully. "It's a clear day," he said softly, keeping his voice low. "The storm is gone." She didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she nodded slightly, still staring at the frozen fields. John noticed her hands, still cold, still tense, and he placed a cup of tea on the table beside her without touching her. She glanced at it, and her fingers closed around the cup like a shield, drawing comfort from its warmth. The morning passed quietly, with small, careful conversations. John spoke about the chores he needed to complete, clearing the snow from the barn, checking the fences for damage, and preparing feed for the animals. Claire listened but didn't offer much. Occasionally, she asked a question about the animals or the ranch, her voice soft but steady. John noticed how cautious she was with her words, as if choosing each one carefully to avoid revealing too much about herself. Despite her silence, John began to notice other signs. There were small things she did unconsciously, fidgeting with the blanket, glancing at the door whenever it opened, pausing at sudden noises. He realized that she was still on edge, still afraid that danger could appear at any moment. The storm outside had passed, but the tension she carried was much deeper, something that couldn't be melted by warmth or food alone. Around midday, John decided to give her more space. He returned to the barn to continue his work, repairing a section of the fence that had broken under the weight of the snow. He worked steadily, moving between the animals and the tool shed, but his mind kept returning to her. He wondered what had brought her here to his door in the middle of the storm. What had she escaped? And why had she whispered, "Please, don't touch me," with such fear? He returned to the house for a brief lunch, bringing Claire a bowl of soup and sitting across from her while she ate slowly. She still avoided his gaze, keeping her eyes fixed on the food or the fire, but John sensed a subtle change. Her breathing was calmer, and the tension in her shoulders had eased slightly. She seemed more willing to exist in the safety of the room, even if she was not yet ready to speak. As the afternoon sun began to lower in the sky, John decided to take a risk. He needed to understand her better, to ensure she was truly safe and not in immediate danger, but he also knew he had to approach carefully. "I know you're scared," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. "You don't have to tell me everything, but if there's something I should know, it could help keep you safe." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face. She shook her head quickly, whispering, "No, I can't." John nodded, not pressing her. He knew that trust had to be earned, not demanded. Instead, he gave her space, returning to his chores while keeping a watchful eye from time to time. Throughout the afternoon, John noticed other subtle signs that something was deeply wrong. There was a small suitcase hidden in the corner of the room, partially covered by a blanket. A faint smell lingered in the air, something metallic and sharp, though he couldn't place it exactly. And most of all, there were her reactions, how she flinched at every noise, how her eyes darted to the windows or the door whenever he moved. Each small action told him that her fear was not just in her mind. It was real, grounded in experience, and something that had chased her to his ranch. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow outside. John returned to the house after checking the animals, bringing in firewood to ensure the room stayed warm through the night. He placed the logs carefully in the fireplace, and the flames flickered, casting a soft glow across the room. Claire sat wrapped in her blanket, watching the fire with a distant expression. Her eyes seemed to follow every flicker of light, every shadow, as if she were trying to understand which parts of the room were safe and which were not. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to bother anyone." John shook his head gently. "You're not a bother, you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." She looked at him then, her dark eyes meeting his for a brief, hesitant moment. For the first time since her arrival, there was a flicker of trust there, though it was fragile and careful. Evening fell, and with it came a heavier quiet. The house was filled with the soft crackling of the fire, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams, and the faint rustle of movement as the animals settled for the night. John decided to check the doors and windows, ensuring everything was secure. He returned to find Claire still sitting by the fire, her blanket wrapped tightly around her. She flinched slightly at his return, whispering the same words from before, "Please don't touch me." John smiled faintly, nodding. "I won't. I promise." He sensed that the repetition of those words was not just a warning, but a way for her to assert some control over the world, to create a boundary that kept her safe. And he respected it, understanding that trust would come in its own time. As the night deepened, John sat across from her, quietly talking about ordinary things: the weather, the routines of the ranch, the animals' habits. He avoided asking about her past, knowing it would only frighten her more. Gradually, he noticed subtle changes. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, her fingers unclenched from the blanket, and her gaze lingered on him for just a fraction longer. She was still cautious, still afraid, but the walls she had built around herself were beginning to shift. Hours passed, and John continued to observe, maintaining a balance between giving her space and providing reassurance. He brought her a warm cup of tea and sat nearby while she drank, never touching her, always respecting her boundaries. In these quiet moments, he realized that the trust they were building was fragile, like ice over a frozen pond, strong enough to walk on carefully but breakable if mishandled. As the night stretched on, a faint sound outside caught John's attention, a distant noise, perhaps a branch falling under the weight of snow. Claire flinched violently, pressing herself further into the blanket. John's heart tightened at the sight, and he spoke softly. "It's okay. You're safe. Nothing can get to you here." She nodded, her eyes wide, still scanning the shadows. He knew that the fear she carried was not just of strangers or the storm, but of something far deeper, something that had chased her across miles to reach this isolated ranch. Finally, exhaustion overcame her. She curled into herself, her breathing slowing, and sleep took her in its fragile hold. John sat back, watching the fire and the shadows, aware that the quiet of the ranch was deceptive. The night was calm, but the tension that lingered between them was far from gone. He did not know what dangers had forced her to flee, what story lay hidden beneath her whispered warnings, or how much time he had to prepare for what might come next. Yet in the midst of uncertainty, John felt a strong resolve. He would protect her, no matter the cost. He would give her the space she needed, the warmth and safety she deserved, and the quiet assurance that she was not alone. And though he did not yet understand the full extent of her fears, he knew that the coming days would bring revelations, challenges, and perhaps even danger. But he was ready to face them, because for the first time in years, his quiet life on the ranch had found purpose beyond the routine. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the icy scent of snow and distant forests. Inside, the fire flickered, casting moving shadows across the walls. John remained alert, his eyes occasionally flicking to Claire, who slept fitfully in the chair. He knew that trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild, and that fear, once planted, took time to fade. But he also knew that in this quiet, fragile moment, he had begun to earn that trust, even if only a little. And so the night passed, long and silent, with only the crackling fire and the distant sounds of the ranch to mark its progress. John watched, waited, and prepared himself, knowing that whatever story Claire carried with her, whatever dangers had chased her to his doorstep, he would face them, and he would not let her face them alone. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the snow-covered ranch, casting a pale, golden light across the fields. John moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb Claire, who had been awake for some time. She sat in the same chair by the window, the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her dark eyes focused on the horizon. There was a tension in her posture, a silent alertness that told John she had not yet fully relaxed. Even with the storm gone and the ranch safe, something deep within her still demanded caution. John poured himself a cup of coffee and brought it over to her, placing it on the small table beside the chair. She looked at it briefly but did not reach for it. Instead, her hands stayed tucked under the blanket, and her eyes remained fixed on the snowy fields. He set the cup down carefully, respecting the boundary she had clearly established. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said softly. "Just stay warm." She nodded slightly, the faintest flicker of acknowledgement passing through her eyes. The morning was quiet, filled only with the soft sound of the wind brushing against the house and the distant cries of birds. John busied himself with small chores, sweeping the kitchen floor and checking the animals outside. Each time he glanced at Claire, he noticed small signs of her fear. The way her fingers trembled beneath the blanket, how she flinched at sudden noises, and how her eyes constantly scanned the room and the outside world. It was clear that whatever had driven her to his ranch was not over yet. By late morning, John realized that she needed more than warmth and safety. She needed reassurance and support. He decided to try something different. "I need to check the barn," he said gently. "Would you like to come with me? You don't have to, but it might help to see that everything is safe." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, then slowly shook her head. John nodded. "That's fine, you stay here. I'll be right back." As he stepped outside, the cold air bit at his cheeks and the snow crunched under his boots. The barn was in good shape, but he walked through it carefully, checking the animals and making sure the fences were secure. He knew that Claire's fear was not just about the storm or the cold. It was about something more, something he could not yet see. Each animal, each task he completed, reminded him of the simple, steady rhythm of life on the ranch, and he hoped that this calm would somehow reach her. Returning to the house, he found Claire sitting in the same position, her blanket drawn tightly around her. The silence between them was thick, almost tangible, and John realized that the time had come to be more direct, though carefully. He sat across from her, keeping his distance, and spoke softly. "I can see that you're scared. I don't know what's happened to you, but I want to help. You can trust me, even if just a little." Her eyes flicked to his briefly, wide and uncertain. She whispered almost inaudibly, I don't know if I can." John nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Trust, once broken, is never easy to rebuild. He decided not to push her further. Instead, he focused on creating a safe environment where she might feel comfortable enough to reveal small parts of her story on her own. Hours passed slowly. John went about his chores while keeping a careful eye on her. He noticed the subtle signs, how she flinched when the wind rattled the windows, how her gaze darted to the corners of the room whenever he moved, and how tightly she held the blanket when she thought no one was watching. He realized that her fear was deeply rooted, and that it would take patience, care, and unwavering respect to help her feel safe. In the afternoon, John decided to try a small gesture of trust. He moved closer to the chair, keeping his hands visible and relaxed, and spoke softly. "There's a warm blanket here for you," he said. "You can use it if you want. No one is going to touch you." She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if measuring the truth in his words. Slowly, she nodded and accepted the blanket, drawing it around her shoulders. It was a small step, but John knew it was significant. As the day wore on, John continued to speak in calm, gentle tones, describing the simple routines of the ranch, the habits of the animals, and the quiet rhythm of his life. Claire listened quietly, sometimes asking small questions about the animals or the work he did. Each question was a small bridge, a connection that slowly built trust without forcing her to reveal anything she was not ready to share. Evening came, and with it, a deeper quiet. The fire in the main room crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls. John brought Claire a bowl of warm soup and sat nearby while she ate, careful not to invade her space. She accepted the food quietly, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the spoon. John noticed the subtle changes. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steadied, and she seemed less tense than earlier in the day. Then, something unexpected happened. Claire shifted slightly in her chair, her gaze lingering on the floor. She whispered almost to herself, "I can't hide it forever." John's heart skipped a beat. He realized that she was ready, finally, to reveal at least a part of the story she had carried with her. He did not move closer, did not rush her, but kept his eyes on her, silently encouraging her to continue. Taking a deep breath, she began, her voice low and trembling. Someone was after me. I don't know why, but they wanted to hurt me. I ran as far as I could." Her hands shook beneath the blanket and she glanced at John, her eyes wide with fear. He nodded gently, offering quiet reassurance without interrupting. "I didn't know where to go," she continued. "The storm, it was the only thing that helped me get here. I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving." Her voice cracked slightly, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. John felt a deep sense of concern and responsibility. The danger she had fled from was real, and she had come to him because she believed he could provide safety. John reached for a small cup of tea, setting it on the table without touching her, and spoke softly. "You're safe now. No one can reach you here." "I'll make sure of that." She looked at him, a faint glimmer of relief passing through her eyes. The tension in her body eased slightly, though her fear was far from gone. For the next few hours they spoke quietly. Claire revealed small pieces of her journey, enough to understand that she had been running for days, afraid of being found. John listened patiently, never pressing for more than she was willing to share. He realized that every detail she revealed was a step toward trust, and every step mattered. As night fell, John made sure the house was secure. He checked the doors and windows, ensuring that no one could enter without being noticed. Claire remained by the fire, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. John sat nearby, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft sounds of the house settling. He felt a mix of relief and concern. Relief that she was finally sharing part of her story, concern for the dangers that might still be waiting beyond the ranch. Then, in a quiet, almost fearful whisper, Claire said something that made John's heart stop. "Please don't lift it." She pointed toward the blanket covering the corner of the room where she had placed a small bundle. John froze. The words were soft, but the urgency in her voice was clear. He realized that whatever she was hiding was important, something she feared revealing, and that respecting her boundaries was crucial. He nodded slowly, keeping his eyes on her. "I won't," he said. "Not until you're ready." She exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and fear crossing her face. The trust between them had deepened, but the tension remained, building toward a moment neither of them could yet predict. As the night deepened, the quiet of the ranch contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions in the room. Claire's fear, the fragments of her story, and the weight of the unknown danger all hung in the air. John remained calm, patient, and watchful, understanding that the next step, when it came, would reveal much more than words alone could convey. And as the fire flickered and the shadows moved across the walls, John realized that the ranch, once a place of routine and solitude, had become a refuge not just for animals and land, but for a life in peril. He knew that soon the full story would come to light, and when it did, he would be ready to face it, no matter how shocking or frightening. The night had settled deep over the ranch, quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of wind against the snow-covered roof. John sat in his chair, keeping a careful watch on Claire. She remained curled in her blanket, eyes wide, alert even in her exhaustion. Something in the air felt different tonight, heavier, as if the story she had carried for so long was ready to reveal itself fully. John knew this moment was approaching. the moment when fear, truth, and trust would collide. He watched her for a while, giving her the space she needed. For days, she had remained tense, careful, guarded. Yet slowly, cautiously, she had begun to speak, revealing fragments of the terror that had brought her to his door. Every word, every detail had been a step toward trust, and now, in the quiet of the night, John sensed that she was ready to confront the part she had hidden so fiercely. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled the blanket closer, her eyes darting toward the corner of the room, where a small bundle lay beneath another cover. Her voice was barely audible as she whispered, "You have to promise, you won't touch it until I say." John nodded solemnly, keeping his distance. "I promise, I'll wait." She gave a faint nod of relief, but the tension in her shoulders did not fade. For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Then, slowly, Claire began to lift the outer blanket, revealing the smaller bundle underneath. John's heart raced, not knowing what he would find, but he remained calm, reminding himself that whatever it was, it belonged to her, and she had entrusted him to wait. As the blanket was lifted fully, John froze. What lay beneath was both shocking and heartbreaking. The young woman had hidden something delicate, fragile, yet deeply significant, a part of her life that had been threatened, something she feared would be lost forever. Her eyes met his, filled with both fear and trust, and he realized that the danger she had escaped was real, that her journey had been far more harrowing than he had imagined. John swallowed hard, keeping his composure. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now. Nothing can hurt you here." Claire's eyes welled with tears, the tension in her body slowly melting as she allowed herself to relax, just slightly, in the safety of the ranch. The trust she had built with him over these days had reached its peak in this fragile, pivotal moment. She began to speak, her voice trembling but gaining strength as she described the events that had forced her to flee. She told him about the threats, the fear, and the relentless pursuit that had left her exhausted and desperate. Each word was careful, measured, yet filled with the raw emotion of someone who had faced danger alone for too long. John listened silently, absorbing every detail without judgment, his focus entirely on her well-being. The hours passed as she recounted her story, and with every sentence, the weight of her fear lessened. She no longer flinched at shadows or sudden noises. The presence of someone who truly cared, someone who had respected her boundaries, had given her a sense of safety she had not felt in months. John remained patient, offering quiet reassurance, occasionally refilling her cup of tea and ensuring the fire kept the room warm. As the night deepened, a sense of resolution began to settle in the room. Claire had faced the darkest moments of her journey, and John had been there to witness them without judgment or intrusion. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe freely, her shoulders loosening, her eyes brighter despite the tears. The trust they had built over these days had transformed fear into a fragile sense of security. Finally, after recounting the events, she rested, exhausted but calmer. John arranged the blankets carefully around her, making sure she was comfortable. "You did well," he said softly. "You were brave to come here to survive. Now you can rest. I'll be here." Her eyes met his, gratitude and relief shining in them, and she whispered a faint, "Thank you," before allowing herself to drift into sleep. John sat back, reflecting on the days that had passed. The arrival of this frightened young woman had disrupted his quiet, solitary life, but it had also given it new purpose. He realized that compassion, patience, and respect could create bonds even in the most uncertain circumstances. The ranch had become more than a home for him. It had become a refuge for someone in desperate need, a place where trust could grow even from fear. The first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, casting soft rays over the snow outside. The world was calm, serene, and yet John knew that life would never be the same. The quiet ranch had been touched by a story of fear and survival, and he had played a role in transforming that fear into safety. He felt a deep sense of responsibility and commitment to Claire's well-being, knowing that the days ahead would require vigilance, patience, and understanding. Morning brought with it a sense of renewal. The snow glistened, and the air was crisp and clean. John moved about the ranch, carrying out his chores with careful attention, all while keeping a watchful eye on Claire. She moved about the house more freely now, though still cautiously, tending to small tasks and observing the routines of the ranch. Each day was a step toward normalcy, a step toward rebuilding trust and confidence. Throughout the morning, they shared quiet conversations. Claire asked questions about the ranch, the animals, and the work that John did each day. He answered patiently, explaining every detail, and she listened with genuine curiosity. There were moments of light laughter as small mishaps occurred, the cat knocking over a pot, a chicken straying from the coop. But even these moments were tinged with caution, a reminder of the fragility of trust and safety. As the day wore on, John noticed a remarkable change. Claire's fear, while not gone, had lessened significantly. She no longer flinched at every sound or shadow. She moved with more confidence, her hands steady, her gaze less darting. The walls she had built around herself were slowly coming down, brick by brick, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of trust. John understood that this was the true victory, not the absence of danger, but the presence of safety, patience, and care that allowed someone to reclaim their courage. By evening, the ranch had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The animals were secure, the fire burned steadily, and the snow outside reflected the fading light of the sun. John and Claire sat quietly in the main room, the warmth of the fire enveloping them. They did not need many words. The silence itself was comforting, a shared understanding that despite everything, the world was safe for now. Then Claire spoke again, softly but clearly. "I think I can start to trust again," she said, her voice steady. John smiled faintly, feeling a sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long, the fear profound, but they had reached a turning point. She had survived, she had found safety, and the trust between them had grown strong enough to allow hope to emerge. The night stretched on, calm and quiet. Outside, the wind whispered softly through the trees, and the snow lay thick and untouched. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of two people who had shared fear, trust, and care created a sanctuary. John knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but for the first time in weeks, Claire could face them without terror, and he could provide guidance, support, and protection. As Claire drifted into a deep, restful sleep, John sat back, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The storm, the fear, the desperate journey, all of it had led to this moment of fragile peace. He understood that trust, patience, and unwavering care had the power to transform fear into hope, and he felt a profound sense of responsibility and pride in having been part of that transformation. The ranch, once a quiet place of routine and solitude, had become something more, a refuge, a sanctuary, and a place where courage could be rebuilt. John knew that the journey was not over, but the most critical step had been taken. Claire had survived. She had revealed the truth she had carried for so long, and she had begun to reclaim her sense of safety. As dawn broke over the snow-covered fields, casting golden light across the ranch, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. Life would continue, challenges would come, but he and Claire had forged a bond built on trust, patience, and care. The fear that had once dominated her life had been met with calm, unwavering support, and in return, trust had begun to flourish. For the first time in many weeks, both of them could breathe freely. The storm had passed, not just outside the ranch, but within the hearts of those who had faced it. And as the light filled the room, John knew that the ranch had become more than a home. It had become a place where safety, trust, and hope could grow, even in the face of fear.